Before I begin this morning, I thought I just want to ask for your prayers for our EDC plane. Of course, just was the one that went down. The Cessna just went down in Mount Mayon last weekend, and we've not been able to get to the crash site until this morning. What I hear is that they're about a kilometer away. Although it's very, very rough ground, and so we just like to ask for your prayers for what is still a search and rescue operation, and the safety also of the rescuers. And I hope that we're able to make it today, and that we're praying for a miracle. So, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. The last time I spoke to you face to face was at the Philippine Environment Summit in Cagayan de Oro in February of 2020. And that's probably the last time we all saw each other face to face. Now, I still remember just having sold my tickets for an Antarctica trip to a colleague and his wife a few weeks earlier, because we were then in the thick of emergency preparations for the onset of the pandemic. I also remember you almost canceled that summit, but at the last minute got clearance from the DOH. And now, of course, congratulations for making it through the pandemic years and now bouncing back to organize this event with even more determination to scale up the solutions to the climate emergency. Now, over these 3 days, I can see that you have a great program of many of the country's best thought leaders that are weaving threads from the respective fields into a tapestry of solutions to the climate crisis. Now, to gain a better understanding of what this involves, allow me this morning to take you a step back and place it in the context of what the world needs to get to and why. The overriding goal is to solve climate change by mitigating and reversing emissions, as well as adapting to its impacts that are already here and intensifying. Now, because I guess if we don't get it right, the exponential deterioration of global climate systems and the environment is going to make it impossible to solve other problems like poverty, inequality, disease, food production, freshwater scarcity, mass migration, social displacement, the mass extinction of species and biodiversity loss, among others. Now, all of this we will feel during our lifetimes, and they're undeniably accelerating, as we can see in news reports every single day now. Now, recall that Paris COP21 applauded the agreements that signaled that we could limit global warming to 2 degrees Celsius if all commitments were met. Now, since then, the IPCC issued in October 2018 a special report on global warming, followed in 2021 and 2022 by its 6th assessment reports from working groups 1, 2, and 3, all with the dire warnings and consequences for a 2 degrees Celsius warmer world. Now, taken together, they underscored the scientific consensus that our targets must not exceed 1.5 degrees by end century. This target is slipping away from us fast, but the 1.5 degrees must still be our base case. Now, consequently, solving climate change means, in phase 1, that we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions of carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxides, and fluorinated gases from the current 50 gigatons of GHGs per year, and hopefully emissions peak by 2025. Now, this is where most efforts are centered today. Now, we cannot stop here at phase 1, but next in phase 2, we aim further to eliminate all the emissions of GHGs and get to net zero emissions by 2050. However, again, it cannot stop here in phase 3. and in phase 2 it cannot stop, but by phase 3, by 2050, we must begin the arduous task of reducing the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and get to what's called net negative emissions. Now, this is best described in the words of NASA climate scientist James Hansen, where he says that if humanity wishes to preserve a planet similar to that on which civilization developed and to which life on Earth is adapted, CO2 will need to be reduced to at most 350 ppm. Now, for reference, and many of you probably know this, the pre-industrialization levels were at 280 ppm. And we sailed past 350 ppm in 1986. We continued to blow through 400 ppm in 2013. That was the same year that Typhoon Yolanda, the most powerful typhoon on Earth to ever make landfall, announced to the world, through the suffering of millions of Filipinos, that climate change is here and that we better get our acts together now. The COVID-19 pandemic has given the world a short respite, but now emissions are on the rise again, and Paris COP21 targets still aren't being met. We now need to realize phases 1, 2, and 3 above within the rapidly diminishing time frame of the next 27 years. Failing to do this over the time frame will trigger irreversible tipping points, the effects of which we are already seeing in news reports from all over the world every day. The clock ticks as we speak. Winning this war and solving climate change will mean staying laser focused on strategies, tactics, and accelerating technologies that are likely to scale within this very critical time frame of the next 27 years. Now, progress through phases 1 to 3 in the battle to solve climate change has many facets beyond just energy. It spans agricultural practices, food production, waste management practices, industrial processes, deforestation, the F-gases used in refrigeration, and many others. But for now, let me just focus on what the foundations to the global energy transition will look like, as it's important that we appreciate what the transition to net zero demands. Now, in this transition, there is what I like to call the cornerstone 1, which is to reduce the carbon intensity of electricity. And here, we're basically cleaning up the electricity grid's generation sources with the intent of progressively lowering the carbon intensity per kilowatt hour. Now, we must keep in mind that as we do this, we keep the lights on and keep power prices affordable. This is very important. Cornerstone 2 is that we scale up energy efficiency efforts. And here we should be scaling up energy efficiency as the so-called first fuel and encourage and incentivize its use everywhere. Now, today, these efforts are still sparse and fragmented, but they have great potential because they have a powerful incentive of real cost savings for the electricity consumer. And with many of these things, as we put them in, they're roughly about even 2 to 3 year paybacks for some. So it makes sense even from an economic standpoint. Then there's cornerstone 3, which is, and you'll hear this phrase a lot, which is you electrify everything. Because with a greener grid, you should now seek to electrify everything from transport to various industrial processes where possible. And remember that electric vehicles aren't green unless the electricity grid it gets its power from is also green. Otherwise, you're just running your electric vehicle on coal. Then there's cornerstone 4, which is to use carbon neutral fuels for the hard to reach sectors, because there are some sectors here that will be very difficult to electrify. Now, with a green grid, there will now be that possibility of producing carbon neutral fuels like green hydrogen and green ammonia for industrial processes and transport sectors like long distance aviation and the rest that cannot be electrified by 2050. And this as the technology matures and gets cheaper during this period. I'd even include maybe some areas of long-distance shipping here. Then, of course, there is Cornerstone 5, where you have to be able to deploy carbon capture, use, and storage. This is CCUS. Now, once you have a zero emissions grid, it will be a crucial component for deeper deployment of electricity-run carbon capture and sequestration technology to arrest more emissions from other hard-to-reach sectors. Now, innovation in CCUS technology is also expected to accelerate in the coming decades. They're a bit expensive today, and the figures I hear are probably in the $500 to $600 per ton of carbon. But eventually, post-2050, these are envisioned to be deployed at scale in phase 3 to get the world to net negative emissions and atmospheric carbon concentrations back to the deemed safe levels of 350 ppm. Now, the magnitudes that I've heard of to achieve this will be anywhere between 20 to 50 gigatons that will need to be captured today. And that's, you compare that to the 50 gigatons that we emit today. So it is a rather large number to start bringing down. But and just in terms of perspective, reforestation and afforestation, considering a lot of the land area availability limitations, they're estimated to capture as much as 5 gigatons per day, if you can scale that up. And if you scale. And improved soil management, what I hear is maybe another 2 gigatons per day. Now, the global energy transition appears straightforward when viewed from its 5 cornerstones. However, they have immense implications for the central role of the electricity grid. The most important is that by 2050, we will need 5 times the electricity that we use today. And we will need 10 to 12 times the clean energy that's in use today. Now, even as we do this, we must continue to improve access to 24/7 electricity for the billions of people, and in the case of the Philippines, millions of households who currently do not have it reliably in their lives, if we are to even begin uplifting them from poverty. Now, Cornerstone 1 alone, which is reducing the carbon intensity of electricity, is a complex balancing act. Adding more 24/7 renewable energy sources like hydro and geothermal power to the grid is straightforward and should be encouraged where we can. What needs to be done thoughtfully is adding more intermittent renewable energy sources like solar and wind, because their variable and intermittent nature necessitates that we match them with more storage to account for the fact that they're not there when night falls or on cloudy or windless days. However, batteries today are only capable of running 3 to 4 hours and still thus fall short of fully providing power for the 10 to 12 hours before the sun rises or the stretches of cloudy or windless days or even weeks. This is why President BBM correctly points out in a number of speeches that I've listened to him, the need for a low carbon emission fuel like natural gas to make sure you can substitute and don't have to add coal plants. And natural gas to act as that bridge fuel that's technically more suited for complementing the variable nature of RE. Without this, it will be very difficult to keep our lights on and affordable as we scale up and deploy more intermittent renewable energy sources into our grids. Now, on the point of affordability, I've always felt that it's the height of insanity to put a price on saving the planet, biodiversity, and humanity. However, if we don't, the transition will suffer political backlash similar to the violent Yellow Vest protests in Paris, when green taxes were imposed on fuels used by most of the working and middle classes for their daily needs. Now, another crucial point to consider is that the buildup of transmission grids and the procurement of ancillary services like redundancy and backup power itself must be debottlenecked and developed in a robust and timely manner. Because if it's not attended to, this will strand the necessary generation investments and deter the massive capacities needed to make the transition successful. Now, of course, over time, as more clean energy and storage is added into our grids, we must look toward decommissioning our fossil fuel powered plants. First, the coal plants, and then ultimately the oil and natural gas plants. Many of you call these natural gas plants even fossil gas plants, which they rightly are. For the latter, the natural gas plants, they can either be repowered with green fuels like hydrogen as they become feasible in the coming decade, or if it's not, then you just outright decommission them before 2050, similar to the process done for the coal plants earlier. Now, we ought to keep an eye out for international funding for decommissioning these plants earlier than their useful lives. And I can see that such funding is increasingly already becoming more available. Now, decarbonizing and scaling up a green electricity grid over the next 3 decades is probably the greatest energy transition in the history of mankind. It's not just changing the electricity system, but building a new global energy system with components that we have never built before at a massive scale. This will need nothing short of collaborative action among various players that today still consider themselves competitors. And these also need well-coordinated and timely action on the part of regulators who must be decisive and well-versed on the elements that make for a successful and just energy transition. The path is made more complex today by the Russia-Ukraine war's effects on energy prices worldwide, and our need to secure energy supplies at a time when all countries in the world are scrambling and paying top dollar to secure theirs, to avoid Russian supplies and energy blackmail. Now, you may ask why the Philippines should undertake this given our limited resources and the fact that we account for only 0.4% of global emissions. Now, I would answer that question in this way. It's apparent that the world is changing. Not as fast as it needs to, but eventually it will and it must. The impacts of the climate crisis as well as climate action that will be demanded of everyone are among the forces in history that will transpire gradually and then suddenly. If we are not prepared and conveniently ignore it, we'll be overwhelmed and not recognize the world around us in the coming 30 years. The science tells us we no longer have a choice. Unless we have more of these pandemics that choke growth, there will no longer be any time extensions. Since we have limited resources, we must choose to spend it wisely and in a future-proof manner. Not on building more coal-fired assets and energy systems that have a mounting risk of becoming stranded because the world no longer wants to finance them, insure them, or buy from them. The earlier we build on these 5 cornerstones, the better positioned our country will be for the massive change that's coming. Now, we are the 4th most climate vulnerable nation on Earth. Some say even the most vulnerable. The poster boys for what's to come are massively destructive typhoons like Yolanda, which was powerful 314 kph winds, or Ondoy, the massive precipitation in highly concentrated cities like Metro Manila, or Duha, which lingered and stayed stationary, dumping rains on us for 3 consecutive days. Now let's expect more of these and prepare. Global warming's higher average temperatures also mean extreme wet seasons, but it also means more extreme dry ones when they come, with dire consequences for our freshwater supplies, and even the possibilities of forest fires as is happening in many developed countries like Australia, the US, and all over Europe as well. Now, with 60% of Filipinos living in coastal cities, in coastal areas, sea level rise is a major threat. Temperatures on the planet are rising fastest at the poles. And this will have grave consequences for sea level rise as tipping points are triggered in the world's cryospheres. The last time CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere were this high was in the Pliocene epoch. That was 3 to 5 million years ago. And average temperatures were 3 to 4 degrees warmer and 10 degrees warmer at the poles. And sea levels were, get this, 5 to 40 meters higher. Now this chart gives you an idea of the potential impact on sea level rise of runaway warming at the poles. Now, permafrost areas in the Arctic Circle are also recently discovered to contain enormous amounts of methane. And methane, as you may know, is 80 plus times more potent a GHG than CO2. And if triggered, it's a tipping point that could release massive emissions equivalent to that of China today. Except the difference will be that no amount of climate negotiations can ever pull that back for a long time. Now, one thought I want to emphasize today is something I remember that Al Gore was saying in 2016 at the Climate Reality Project Leadership Training at the Sofitel Manila, where Rodney, of course, was heading our efforts then for the Philippines. Now, Al Gore was saying, I remember this so well, he said, all our infrastructure was built for a world that's now changed. Now at 1.1 degrees Celsius of warming, where we are today, the world has already changed. It will be more so even as we successfully navigate the journey to limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So even as we successfully navigate that journey, those changes will come. Now our company learned this the hard way when our geothermal power plants were hit by successive typhoons, starting with Yolanda and a few others, and they were all triggering landslides that tore away our mountain roads and steam lines, and powerful winds that blew away our cooling towers and buildings. Over the following years, of course, we identified and mapped out 186 geohazard areas all over our geothermal sites and reinforced them to remove their vulnerabilities to the extreme weather events. We also tore down and redesigned our cooling towers for a higher standard that would withstand 300 kph winds. We even helped competitors hit by typhoons subsequently to get back on their feet months ahead by sharing our strategic spares with them. Now we do this because we believe that collaboration and community will be necessary elements to any effort to build a climate resilient country. Now beyond our company, I see many worthwhile efforts to build climate resilience. Storm-ravaged Batanes finally buried their power lines underground to keep power flowing even in the aftermath of numerous typhoons that hit them each year. Almost every major developed city has climate change action plans. Tokyo has its network of underground tunnels and cathedral-sized cisterns that can divert flooding with high-speed pumps that can empty a 50-meter Olympic-sized pool in 6 seconds flat. They originally built for rains of 55 millimeters per hour, but are now upping this standard for new flood control projects to 65 to 75 millimeters per hour. Malaysia has its famous 9.7 kilometer smart tunnel that converts an underground roadway into a flood diversion tunnel when needed. London has its famous Thames barrier that protects London from similar flooding events. Now, I've heard of similar projects being planned for Singapore, New York, Boston, and other important cities. Now, we need a comprehensive, integrated, and well-studied national decarbonization and adaptation plan of our own, backed by constant feedback from what science is telling us. Now, in addition to creating a future-ready energy system, Our being fourth on the world's climate vulnerability list necessitates that we prepare Philippine cities, communities, and infrastructure for resilience in a climate change world. We need to do this in a systematic and collaborative way if we want to succeed and make serious headway in tackling other issues like hunger, poverty, and other pressing sustainable development goals of our time. Trying to solve those will be futile if we don't build for the resilience we need and if we don't ultimately solve climate change. Now, COP27 has just concluded with a significant step towards addressing climate justice following the agreement to establish a loss and damage fund that will address climate impacts in developing countries. This is an acknowledgement of the vast inequities of the climate crisis and is meant to provide financial assistance to poor countries that are also the most vulnerable to climate disasters, even if they were the least responsible for historic carbon emissions. Now, crucial details of these facilities still need to be fleshed out, but at least the principle is finally on the table. The US has also just signed into law last October 2022 the Inflation Reduction Act, that despite the bland-sounding name, includes an estimated $369 billion of funding for climate and energy-related projects in the next decade. Now, the analysts of Credit Suisse believe that this number is actually understated. They believe that incentives for electric vehicles and zero-carbon electricity are uncapped in the law. There is no budget limit written into the law that caps how much government can spend. Thus, the number could be more than double of that estimate and 3 times more if you factor in private investment that will be catalyzed by this. Now, many believe that this could be the equivalent of the moonshot efforts that stimulated countless innovations that got a man on the moon before the end of the decade, as Kennedy declared in 1962. Now, it's expected that similar waves of innovation to combat the climate crisis will result from this. And I'm hearing that even in Europe and other parts of the world, there's a bit of a race that's going on because of this. And I hope it triggers that kind of a race in a good way. Now, let's be ready as this spill over to the rest of the world rapidly and be part of the waves that use and proliferate these solutions to serve our markets, customers, and communities. Now, having said all that, it's clear that the forces being triggered by the climate crisis and planetary degradation are very real. They're shaping local and global politics like no other time in history. Our social, economic, and political systems are all causing us to overshoot almost all of our planet's ecological ceilings. Biodiversity loss is happening at a rate that's hundreds of times faster than it's been over the last 10 million years because of human activity. On the average, we use up 1.75 Earths each year to feed and fuel our current economies and lifestyle. Developed country lifestyles, they use up an average of 4 Earths. And everyone aspires to that. Yet, the inequality of benefits has caused massive shortfalls in the provision of basic foundations for billions of people all over the world. Poverty, hunger, loss of livelihoods has triggered wars, conflicts, and mass migration all over the world. We're heading into a more unequal and politically unstable world, yet one that's still driven primarily by metrics such as profit maximization, maximization of shareholder value, and GDP growth. Remember too that healthy forests and trees are never given any value in GDP until they're cut down and used as wood. Rich schools of fish, corals, and turtles are also not reflected in GDP until they appear on your dinner plate or they're hung as ornaments on your wall as table decor. The massive geologic scale changes that humans have had on the planet is raising a debate among scientists over whether we have now left the 11,700-year Holocene epoch and entered a new one defined by the permanent mark being left by human activity on the atmosphere. Being left on the atmosphere, on climate, on mass extinctions, and ocean pollution, among other impacts. The Nobel laureate Paul Crutzen popularized the term Anthropocene, anthropo for man and scene for new. The International Union of Geological Sciences, the IUGS, which is the organization in charge of defining Earth's time scale, hasn't decided this yet, given their concern that these human-induced changes must reflect in the planet's rock strata. But regardless of how this is resolved, one thing is for sure. The human impact on the planet's climate, as it has been over the last 11,700 years, is altering extremely fast, putting into question whether we and millions of other species can adapt fast enough. Today, more than 1 million of the 8 million known species of flora and fauna are in danger of extinction, many of them possibly in the next few decades alone. We are degenerating our home faster than we can cope. Now, admittedly, these are tough times for those who consider themselves environmentalists. Now, I'm sure almost all of you in the audience today alternate between feelings of hope and despair when you project the current state of affairs onto the kind of world that we're leaving behind. Many young couples today from this new birth stripe community are choosing not to have children because they feel it irresponsible to birth someone into a catastrophic planet. In 2018, a US civil rights attorney and climate activist doused his own body in gasoline and set himself on fire to dramatize what we're doing to ourselves by our dependence on fossil fuels. Now, I believe there are better ways to channel rage and grief, preferably toward a vision of collective resilience and adaptation, as well as the kind of future that we want to live in. Now, technology or even climate geoengineering that people are already starting to talk about. But by themselves, this will not save the day for us. The times call for new paradigms and social constructs. We will need to measure progress using new metrics and reshape our way of life to thrive in a changed and rapidly changing world. It's all about reimagining our relationship to the planet and to one another. The flip side of the word Anthropocene is that if humans have such immense power to degenerate the earth, if we so choose, humanity can also wield the same power to change course and regenerate it, if not just for the sake of currently living humans, but also for the millions of other species that co-inhabit our world, and not only today, but even those of tomorrow. Now, in closing, recall the words of F. Scott Fitzgerald in a famous 1936 essay where he said that often quoted line of where he says that the measure of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposed ideas in the mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function. Now, what many are less aware of is his mostly forgotten next sentence, which goes on to say that one should, for example, be able to see that things are hopeless and yet be determined to make them otherwise. Now, as climate crisis warriors, never ever forget that hope resides precisely in the spaciousness of uncertainty, and our inimitable inimitable ability to act in concert to build that future where we thrive together. Thank you very much.